They fined me $4,800 because I refused to let them drive across my property anymore. 6 weeks later, the same people who called me a problem were sitting across from my lawyer, trying to figure out how much they owed me. And the funniest part? They had spent months threatening to take my land away, only to discover they had been using it the entire time. My name is Ethan Parker. I am 38 years old, and I never expected a simple steel gate on my own property to turn into a fight that involved an entire neighborhood, a developer, and millions of dollars in hidden problems. I grew up around land disputes because my grandfather was the kind of man who believed a handshake mattered. But he also believed you should always know exactly what you own. He bought our 11-acre piece of land outside Bellstone, Colorado back in 1962, long before there were fancy neighborhoods, private clubs, or signs at the entrance saying, "Welcome to Oak Valley Estates." Back then, it was just open fields, dirt roads, and a few families who knew each other by name. My grandfather spent decades improving that land, and when he passed it down to me, he left behind more than property. He left behind a responsibility. For years, my land was quiet. I built a small workshop, repaired old equipment, planted trees, and enjoyed having a place where I could hear birds instead of construction crews. Then Oak Valley Estates arrived. At first, I had no problem with development. People need homes, communities grow, and progress is normal. The developer, a company called Summit Crest Communities, even approached my family years earlier about buying a small section of the property. My grandfather refused politely. He told them, "Some things aren't for sale." Apparently, they never forgot that. When the neighborhood was built, everything changed. Suddenly, trucks started cutting across the corner of my property. Delivery vehicles used it. Maintenance crews used it. Contractors used it. At first, I ignored it because I didn't want to be the difficult neighbor. I figured a few vehicles here and there were not worth creating a fight over. But a few vehicles became dozens every day. Then came the damage. Heavy trucks tore up the gravel path I maintained. Workers left trash near my fence line. One crew even damaged part of my drainage system and acted like it was no big deal. I contacted the HOA president, a woman named Linda Mercer, hoping we could solve it like adults. She showed up at my gate wearing a perfectly pressed jacket, carrying a folder full of HOA documents like she was arriving at a courtroom. She looked at the damage, looked back at me, and said, "Ethan, this road has always been considered community access." I remember laughing a little because I honestly thought she was joking. I said, "Community access? Linda, this is my property. Where is the agreement allowing everyone to use it?" She smiled like she had already won. "You don't get to decide that after all these years." That sentence bothered me more than the trucks, not because it was rude, but because it revealed something important. They weren't asking for permission. They believed they already had control. So I did what any engineer would do. I started looking at the paperwork. I checked my property records, old surveys, county maps, and every document I could find. What I discovered made me sit back in my chair and read the same pages 3 different times because I thought I had missed something. According to county records, there was no permanent access agreement, no recorded easement, no legal document giving them the right to use my land. The only thing I found was a temporary construction access agreement from years earlier, and it had expired long before the neighborhood was finished. I knew immediately this was bigger than a driveway dispute. But before I could do anything, I decided to install a steel gate. Not a wall, not something designed to start a war, just a gate that said, "If you want to use this property, let's have a conversation first." The reaction was immediate. Within days, HOA representatives arrived. They weren't interested in talking. They were angry. They told me I was disrupting the community. They threatened legal action. They said I was blocking essential access. I calmly asked them one question. "Can you show me the document that says you have permission?" Nobody answered. Instead, 3 weeks later, I received the letter, a $4,800 fine, and at the bottom was the threat that if I didn't remove the gate, they would pursue further action against my property. They thought that letter would scare me into backing down. They thought I was just another homeowner who would pay the fine and move on. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't fighting over a gate anymore. I was about to find out exactly how much of their entire neighborhood had been built on something they never legally owned. The more I looked into the records, the more uncomfortable the truth became. At first, I thought I was just going to prove one simple point, that Oak Valley Estates did not have permission to use my driveway area. I figured maybe someone made a mistake years ago. Maybe a developer forgot to file some paperwork. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a conversation. But every document I pulled opened another door, and behind every door was another problem. I spent several evenings at my kitchen table surrounded by old maps, property surveys, and county records. My coffee would get cold because I would get so focused that I forgot it was even sitting there. My wife, Sarah, would walk by and shake her head. She knew that look on my face. She had seen it before when I was solving engineering problems at work. She said, "You have that look again." I asked, "What look?" She smiled and said, "The one where you find something and then nobody gets to sleep until you figure out the whole story." She was right. I couldn't stop because something about this felt wrong. It wasn't just about money or a gate. It was about the idea that someone could slowly take control of something simply because nobody challenged them. So I went back to the county records office and started tracing everything connected to the development. The access road was the first surprise. The main road connecting Oak Valley Estates to the highway did not belong to the neighborhood. Nearly 240 feet of that road crossed my property line. The developer had been using my land as the entrance route for hundreds of families. There was no permanent easement, no recorded agreement, nothing. The temporary access paperwork they had relied on was from 2016, back when construction was beginning, and it clearly had an expiration date. They had built an entire community assuming nobody would ever look closely. But I wasn't finished. I checked the utility records. That was when things went from surprising to unbelievable. The sewer line serving the entire neighborhood ran through the eastern corner of my property. 320 homes were connected to a system that crossed land they did not have legal permission to use. I sat there staring at the document thinking, there's no way this is real. So I checked again. Same result. Then came the electrical records. The transformer that powered a large portion of the community sat on my land. The installation permit was outdated and never converted into a permanent agreement. Then I found the stormwater drainage system. Every time it rained heavily, runoff from the neighborhood flowed through channels onto my property and into my retention pond. They had been using my land as part of their drainage plan without a recorded agreement or proper approval. Finally, I found the fiber line. The internet connections serving the community had been installed underground across my property as well. Road, sewer, electricity, drainage, and communication. 5 separate systems, all depending on land they didn't legally control. I remember sitting there late at night looking through those papers. And honestly, I didn't feel angry at first. I felt disappointed because this wasn't some random accident anymore. This was a pattern. Someone had built something massive and assumed the quiet guy next door would never question it. The next morning, I called an attorney named Michael Reeves. I brought him a folder so thick that when I placed it on his desk, he actually laughed. He said, "Ethan, either you found nothing or you found everything." I told him, "I think I found everything." He spent the next few days reviewing the documents. When he finally called me back, his tone was completely different. He wasn't joking anymore. He said, "You need to understand something. This isn't a neighborhood dispute. This is an infrastructure issue. We prepared formal notices, not angry letters, not emotional threats, just facts." The notice went to Summit Crest Communities, Oak Valley Estates HOA, the electric provider, the fiber company, and the county utility department. The message was simple. You are using private property without legal authorization. Either stop using it or negotiate a proper agreement. The reaction was exactly what I expected. At first, they ignored it. Then they became aggressive. Linda Mercer from the HOA called me personally. She wasn't as confident as before. I could hear the frustration in her voice. "Ethan, do you understand what you are doing? You're affecting hundreds of residents." I replied, "Linda, I'm not affecting your residents. I'm asking why everyone has been affecting me." There was silence. Then she said, "This could become very expensive for everyone." I said, "I agree. That's why I wish someone had checked the paperwork years ago." That was the moment the tone changed. They realized I wasn't bluffing. A few days later, I closed the gate completely. The neighborhood still had access through another route, but it added about 2.5 miles to their drive. For the first time in years, they had to deal with the inconvenience they had created for someone else. Suddenly, people started asking questions. Residents wanted answers. Homeowners who had never heard of easements or property rights were now reading about them online. Some blamed me. Others started asking why the developer never disclosed these issues. Then I filed an official complaint with the county. That was when everything moved faster than anyone expected. Inspectors started reviewing permits, officials started comparing maps, and within weeks, the people who had confidently fined me $4,800 were facing a much bigger problem. Because this was no longer about whether I had the right to install a gate, it was about whether an entire development had been built on years of unauthorized use. And when the county finally released their findings, even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. When the county report finally came back, the entire neighborhood changed overnight. The same people who had spent weeks telling me I was causing problems were suddenly asking for meetings, asking for explanations, asking how we could fix something they had spent years ignoring. The $4,800 fine that was supposed to make me back down had become the smallest issue in the room. Nobody was talking about my gate anymore. Nobody was calling me unreasonable. Now the questions were much bigger. How did an entire neighborhood get built around infrastructure that was never properly documented? Who approved the plans? Who checked the property records? And why did nobody ask the one person whose land they were using? The county investigation moved quickly once officials started comparing old surveys with current development maps. They confirmed what my attorney and I had already discovered. The access road, drainage routes, and several utility connections were tied directly to my property without the permanent agreements required by law. For the unfinished portion of Oak Valley Estates, the county issued a temporary construction suspension. 26 homes that were still waiting for final approval could not move forward. Those houses represented millions of dollars for Summit Crest communities. And suddenly, every day the issue remained unresolved was costing them money. That was the moment the developer's attitude changed completely. Before, I was just the homeowner who put up a gate. Now, I was the person holding the paperwork that explained why their entire system was vulnerable. A few days later, I received a call from their attorney asking for a meeting. The same company that once sent letters threatening legal action was now requesting a conversation. I remember hanging up the phone and just sitting there for a minute, not because I felt victorious, but because I was thinking about how different this could have been. All of this started because nobody wanted to have a simple conversation. Nobody wanted to say, "Hey, we need something from you. Can we make a fair agreement?" Instead, they assumed ownership because the situation had gone unchallenged for years. The emergency mediation took place in a conference room downtown. I walked in carrying the same folder I had carried into my attorney's office weeks earlier. The difference was that this time, everyone in the room knew what was inside. On one side sat Summit Crest Communities. Their developers, engineers, and lawyers were there. On another side sat the HOA board members. The utility companies had representatives too. The atmosphere was completely different from the first meeting I had with Linda Mercer. There was no arrogance, no accusations, no one telling me I didn't understand my own property. My attorney opened the meeting with a simple statement. This isn't about stopping a community. This is about correcting a mistake that should have been addressed before anyone built on this land. That sentence changed the entire conversation, because I wasn't asking to punish innocent homeowners. I wasn't trying to ruin people's lives. I knew many residents had nothing to do with what happened. They bought their houses believing everything was handled properly. They trusted the developer. They trusted the paperwork. The problem was that the paperwork was never complete. Over the next several weeks, negotiations continued. Every piece of infrastructure was evaluated separately. The road access required one agreement. The drainage system required another. The utility connections had their own terms. When everything was finally added together, the settlement became something nobody in that neighborhood expected. Summit Crest Communities agreed to pay $525,000 for permanent access rights related to the road and stormwater system. They also paid $190,000 for years of previous unauthorized use. The electric provider reached a separate agreement for the transformer location, including $70,000 upfront and annual payments for future use. The fiber company paid $55,000 for the underground cable route across my land. The HOA withdrew every fine they had issued against me, covered my legal expenses, and permanently removed my property from their authority. No HOA fees, no design restrictions, no community rules applied to my land unless I personally agreed to them. But the part that meant the most to me came at the very end of the agreement. I was given approval rights over future infrastructure changes affecting my property. From that point forward, nobody could decide to run a pipe, move a utility line, or create access through my land without sitting down with me first. And honestly, that was the thing I cared about more than the money. Money comes and goes, Respect is harder to get back once someone takes it away. A few months later, I stood next to the steel gate that started everything. I remember looking at it and almost laughing because it was still just a gate. It wasn't some powerful symbol. It wasn't a massive wall. It was a simple piece of metal that represented one simple idea. You have to ask before you take. The neighborhood eventually moved on. Most residents were just happy the issue was resolved. Some still believed I should have handled things differently. They said I could have avoided the conflict by opening the gate and negotiating later. Maybe they were right. Maybe there was a softer way. But I also believe something important happened because I refused to ignore the problem. If I had paid the fine, opened the gate, and walked away, nobody would have ever looked deeper. The roads would still be there. The pipes would still be there. The agreements would still be missing. Sometimes problems continue not because they are invisible, but because everyone hopes someone else will deal with them. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about an HOA, a developer, or even a piece of land. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide to question something that everyone else accepts without thinking. It's about boundaries. It's about responsibility. And it's about the difference between being difficult and simply refusing to be ignored. So I want to know what you think. If you discovered that an entire community was using your property without permission, would you have handled it the same way I did? Would you have opened the gate and tried to negotiate quietly? Or would you have stood your ground until the paperwork was fixed? Leave your thoughts in the comments because this kind of situation always creates strong opinions. Some people believe protecting your property is always the right thing to do. Others believe communities sometimes require compromise. Maybe the answer is somewhere in between. But one thing is certain. Before anyone tells you what you can and cannot do with your own land, make sure they know who actually owns it. If you enjoy stories about unexpected legal battles, property conflicts, and ordinary people finding strength when they are pushed too far, subscribe to the channel because sometimes the biggest victories don't come from having the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes they come from having the documents, the patience, and the courage to finally say, "Show me where it says you can."